So everyone, and welcome to the Advanced Magia Record Guides for buffs, debuffs and status ailment. Now in a battle there are 5 different types of effects that can affect your character. There's buffs, support effects, granted effects, debuffs and status ailments. Out of these, buffs, supports and granted effects, they're all beneficial to your characters, while debuffs and status ailments, they all hurt your characters in some way. Now, of course, as the title of this video might clue you in, the important ones are the buffs, debuffs, and ailments, but let's go very quickly over the support effects and the granted effects to get them out of the way. So first off, we have the status effects. By the way, this is the fandom wiki for Magia Record, the skills and status effects site, and here we see a list of status effects with some descriptions. I'm going to tell you some of the more important stuff that the wiki might not tell you about. So these support effects, they're really just something like heals in various ways. Like for example, you can heal HP, MP, heals you instead of dying. Like basically survive is you don't die for a turn, and once the turn ends you then regenerate some MP. It's basically a better form of endure, and we're gonna see what endure is as well later. But if you're wondering, like, endure, survive, isn't that kind of the same? Yep, but survive is way better. So we also have the ability to remove buffs, or remove status ailments, remove all kinds of stuff, and revive, which I think right now only Iroha can do that with her Magia that revives a random character, or the last fallen ally actually. And I think those, yeah, that's pretty much all that there is for support. So that's really some really basic stuff, heals you in some way, helps you in some very basic way. And the other part is the granted effects. Now there's a lot more of these, and they're all rather special, but a lot of these, they kind of tell you very easily what they are just by looking at them. For example, damage up, increased damage on attacks. Wow, really? I did not expect that. You can also see on this page that a lot of stuff that was found in the game files, but that was never actually used anywhere in the game, so it's not really seen as implemented. There's also something like, for example, ignore enemy defense or reduce damage, really basic stuff. And you might see something like this later on as well in this video on the sections of buffs, debuffs, and you're going to be wondering, this does some very similar stuff, for example, especially the damage up. We're going to see that in the buff section as well. And you might be wondering, what's the difference then if this is also in the buff section, but in a different color? So you see right now it's a yellow color. We're going to see one in the buff section that has the red color. What's the difference? I'm going to tell you what the difference is later, but for right now I'm just going to tell you that granted effects are basically effects that are like short-term special occasions, basically. Short-term special occasions. That is how I want you to think about granted effects, even though not all granted effects are short-term special things, but for the most part that's kind of what they are. Later on, when we talk about buffs and debuffs, you'll see that buffs and debuffs just make stats go up and down. And also a lot of stuff that's like really special, that isn't just stats going up and down, that's also falls under granted effects. So for example, critical hit. That's not just a stat going up and down, that's like a special thing by itself. As critical hit also tells you right here. If it didn't mention this here, I would have told you right now, but critical strike doesn't stack. So if, for example, you have the I Made Friends Memoria, and let's say you have 25% chance to critical hit with that Memoria, and then you get connected by, I think it's Masara, who has like 80% chance to crit, and then you might be wondering, okay, 25% chance to hit, 80% chance to crit, how do those two stack? Do I now have 105% chance to crit, or how does that work? Or do I have two chances, a 25% chance and then an 80% chance? No, it just takes the highest value. In this case would be 80%, and it just says, okay, you now have 80% chance to crit. This is also why if you have someone with I Made Friends and you connect with them so they now have critical hit, it kind of diminishes the effect that I Made Friends has. It's still a really strong connect. I mean, it's still a strong connect to have like a really high crit chance, but you already had a crit chance that you're now overwriting for this one turn, so it's not quite as effective. We also have evade, similarly to critical hit. If you have multiple sources of evade, only the highest one counts. So if you now said, okay, 25% chance from a Memoria to evade, or 20% chance, and now you get a connect that gives you like, let's say like 50% chance, then 50% chance, the only one that counts, and the Memoria effect gets overwritten because it's less. Also something very important, and this is why I wanted to make a special mention of ailments later as well. If a character is afflicted with a status ailment, they cannot evade. So if, for example, you're in mirrors and you think or you know that someone on the enemy team has an evade Memoria, you might be like, once you are at like turn 3 and you have availability for your curse Memoria, you can say, I'm going to curse that character, so now they can't dodge anymore. That's also something to keep in mind if you are playing in PvE against bosses and enemies that apply status ailments to your characters. You might be saying, okay, by Tsuruno, for example, I want her to evade after her Magia, but these enemies, they're spamming curse on my team, so I'm gonna put a Bible on my Tsuruno, so now she's immune to curse, therefore she's not going to get cursed, and she'll be able to dodge. And if she didn't have that and she was getting cursed, she wouldn't be able to dodge anymore. Something to keep in mind there. Next up, we have counter. Counter is something that you won't see that often, and it's not that strong of an ability, but it is something to keep in mind. There are some things that go on with counter, for example, as it tells you right here, it does not apply on-hit effects. Like, for example, if a character has on hit, it burns the character that you're attacking, or on hit, it seals enemy Magia. There's some effects that are like this. This won't be applied by a counter attack. Also, usually when a character attacks or gets attacked, they receive either of the two, both of them actually, receive some MP. Not in the case of a counter. And also, counter does ignore evade. Something that doesn't quite say here is, actually no, with follow-up attack. I'm going to go into this with follow-up attack, but there's something that is also not mentioned here is that when you do a counterattack, this counterattack is not being done at full strength. There is, I think, like an 80% damage modifier when you do use a counterattack, so it is weaker than a regular attack would be. And it also says that it's subject to strong, weak element modifiers. So, for example, if you have a fire character countering into a forest character, that would deal bonus damage, of course. Next up, we have follow-up attack, also called just chase. And chase, as it shows you right here, does not attack if the ally's single target attack kills the enemy, because of course if the enemy is dead, there's no one to chase against. Also, it says ignores evade and is subject to strong, weak element damage modifiers, similar to as we saw on counter. Something that it doesn't mention here that I want to talk about is, though, that if a character attacks into someone and that character evades the attack, you can then still get a chase on that character and it will ignore the evade as well. So not only does the chase ignore evade in itself, it also gets triggered by attacks that were evaded. So it's a really nice way of dealing with evade in that way. Next up, we have damage up on enemies with status ailments. This is also something that is important for the damage calculations. I'm going to do a different video just on the damage calculation. So right now I'm not going to go too much into actual numbers, because there's going to be some numbers involved in here, but I'm only going to tell you like, hey, this is something to keep in mind for the damage calculation video, because the damage calculation stuff is quite extensive and I'm going to give it its own video to make sure it's fine. So I'm going to mention this again in the damage calculation video. You also have endure, something similar to what we saw earlier, where it's like, hey, you survive one attack with 1 HP. In this case, it's just one attack with 1 HP, while survive, the support effect, gave you the ability to survive every single attack in a single turn, and then you got healed at the end of it. And endure just makes you survive one attack, and then it's gone. So survive, way better than endure, but don't count endure out. We also have taunt. Basically, it acts as if you selected another character with the disc, the character that was taunting. There's also HP region, empty region. It kind of tells you what it does by itself. You also have skill search, or just a cooldown lowering. I don't know what to call it else. I think it's called skill quick as well. Yeah, skill quick in the Japanese. Reduces the cooldown active Memoria by an additional 1 each turn. Something to note is some Memorias might say something like, or some effects might say something like 20% chance to skill search. What does that mean, 20% chance to skill search? in that case is when you end the turn and then your next turn begins, there's a 20% chance that all your active Memoria will be cooling down for an additional turn. So for example, you start your Mirror's battle, you have a Memoria that has a 3-turn cooldown, you do your first turn, and you have a 10% chance, for example, to get a skill quick. Then on your second turn, if that 10% chance procs, so you get lucky, there's a 10% chance that happens, you then were to be able to use that 3-turn cooldown Memoria because it cooled down for an additional turn. Guard also takes an attack in place of an ally, very similar to Taunt, but not quite the same. The differences between Taunt and Guard lie also in the targeting for blast discs. So Taunt will completely redirect the blast somewhere else, while for Guard, if there were multiple characters getting hit by a blast, one of those characters might get guarded, but the other two would still get hit by the blast. So in that case, usually Taunt is better than Guard, because Taunt also protects other characters from blast discs. Something pretty interesting to note. MP gain up weak, this is basically Victory T effect, and this is one of the worst effects in the entire game, because when you're taking damage from the element the character is weak to, in PvP you're dead. In PvE you're still taking a bunch of damage, and why not just take a Memoria that makes you take more damage or deal more damage instead of this? I don't know. This is also something that's only, I think, on one single Memoria in the game, and it's, I think, a free Memoria that everyone, I think, got. But also not very important. If you come from Fate Ground Order, you might be thinking like, oh, is there something like Kaleidoscope? No, there's not. And it's a good thing there isn't, because that would make PvP really fucking weird. There's also ignore, reduce damage, ignore an opponent's damage card, a lot of this stuff basically tells you what it is in itself, like ignore these effects on enemies, immunity to these sorts of effects, and that's grounded effects. We talked a lot about grounded effects, but a lot of these basically told you what they do by themselves, and there's not a whole lot of other special stuff to it. If there is special stuff to it, it tells you right here. So that's why I want to get them out of the way right now. Now, though, let's go into buffs. So buffs are also rather straightforward in that they just raise a stat for a character. For example, right here, by the way, you see all of these have red symbols. You see that there's just the regular increased attack based on base stat, or just increased base attack, you could also say. Not quite base attack, but yeah. Increased character based defense, increased damage on attacks, Magia damage, double damage, all this kinds of stuff. Something to notice that it says here not yet implemented for some of these. These are actually implemented on JP version in the Spirit Enhancement. So Spirit Enhancement does actually have some of these implemented, for example this one, and I think this one as well. This one I think as well. So these one are actually implemented on JP. So you might be thinking to yourself, okay, so I have all these buffs. First off, we found the damage up effect again. So as you remember down at the grounded effects, we had the damage up effect, and here we have the damage inflicted up effect. They look the same, just one of them is yellow and the other one is red. One is called damage up, the other one is damage inflicted up. Isn't that kind of the same? Isn't that kind of the same? And I'll tell you right now, yes, it is pretty much the same. If we're gonna go into the damage calculation in some other video, but they appear right next to each other and do pretty much the same. They both do the same. The only thing that is noteworthy right now is that, I can tell you right now, I'm not going to mention this in a damage calculation video, but every single buff stacks to a maximum of 100% bonus. And damage inflicted up does not factor into the same stack that damage up stacks counters into. So you can get a 100% damage inflicted up bonus, and you can get a 100% damage up effect. So that's basically all there is. But like I said, I'm going to go more into this in the other video. Right now, the only thing you need to note is that they basically do the same thing, but they go into different stacks, and that's all there is to it. That's literally all there is to it. Now, when you look at these buffs, a lot of these buffs are numbers based, like for example 50% damage up or 20% damage inflicted up, 20% Magia up, stuff like that. Everything is about numbers when it comes to buffs instead of just special effects that just happen. And the important part to note about these numbers is you might be thinking to yourself, okay, how do you work with these numbers when, for example, let's say you have a 20% damage or let's say 20% attack up. Now an enemy casts an effect on you, 50% attack down. Will you then be at 50% attack down? Or will it factor into the 20% you already have and it will instead drop you to 30% damage attack down? The answer to that is it will put you to 30% attack down. You can imagine basically with buffs and debuffs for each individual stat that first off you start at neutral, 0%. You can get pushed into the negative by debuffs, for example minus 50% damage, and when you get a buff you will then be pushed into the positive. So for example, as in the example, imagine when you get the 20% damage buff, I keep saying it, damage or attack pretty much interchangeably. Let's say you get 20% damage up, you get then pushed 20% into the positive, and then when you get the 50% damage down, you then get pushed 50% towards the other side. You pass the equilibrium, you pass 0% and keep going, and you land at 30% in the negative. Then if you get hit by, like, let's say at 100% positive, you would then 100% like damage buff, you would then be pushed into the positive again, past the 0% mark, and you would end up at 70% bonus damage. And that's basically how buffs and debuffs work, is they're like pushing the slider left and right whenever you get hit by one of these buffs. Or to put it differently, buffs and debuffs of the same type all stack additively. But there is a maximum of 100% bonus or 100% malice. So the maximum you can have is minus 100% attack, or a minus 100% attack or plus 100% attack. That's like the edges of the slider that you have. Same thing goes for everything in here. All of these effects work exactly like this. If you were afflicted with a 50% blast down, you can then just give yourself 100% blast up, and you will land at, in total, a 50% blast up. Nice. That's basically what I want you to take away from buffs, because this is something that is really important to note. When it comes to granted effects, you can be like, okay, I'm going to give myself crit, and I'm just going to crit. The highest one counts, done. But when it comes to buffs and debuffs, it's a lot more important to be aware of how you can push the slider left and right, and how you can use that to your advantage. So, for example, when you think to yourself, okay, my character from a Memoria, for example, gets a 25% damage up, and I have a connect that gives another 50% damage up, and then I have another connect. I'm going to give two connects in the same turn for another 50% damage up. Maybe I have also on top of that an active Memoria that I'm going to activate for another 50% damage up. You're going to push that slider into the 100% almost immediately, and all of these effects are poofing. You're not getting anything. You get to a maximum of 100%. All these other connects, all the other effects that are doing nothing. Absolutely nothing, because you're already at 100%. But let's say your character instead gets hit with a debuff. Your character gets hit with like a 70% damage down debuff. You can be like, oh my god, 70% damage down. Maybe I should just pass this turn, right? And maybe start up next turn. But I have so many damage up effects on me. So I could just give my character two connects and the active Memoria and push myself really far to the other side, negate the debuff, and actually end in the positive. This is something you can do if you are aware of this slider system left and right, where you can override, not override, but you can diminish the effect of debuffs and even turn them into buffs if you keep putting on more buffs and more buffs. But on the flip side, if you are already in the positive, if you already have something like a plus 50% damage up, you probably don't want to put another plus 50% damage up on there, or even more, like a plus 60, plus 70% damage up on there, because you're just overcapping and it won't do anything. That's basically the main takeaway from buffs and debuffs. Of course, there's also some other stuff with the support effect, like removing buffs and debuffs, but this is used almost never. Some challenge bosses will use this, where in between turns they will maybe remove debuffs, or maybe they will remove status ailments from themselves. And that's basically all it is with the removal effects. These removal effects are really underutilized. They happen almost never in the game. which is kind of sad. But yeah, once we then go to the debuffs, you see that the debuffs are basically exactly the same as the buffs. They're blue, by the way. And they just go down instead of up. But that's pretty much exactly the same, as you can see. They just go down instead of up. Wow. But yeah, this is the interplay between buffs and debuffs, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, how do status ailments go into all of this? Now, as I told you, buffs and debuffs, they're all just about pushing numbers up and down. Pushing numbers up and down, that's buffs and debuffs. Don't worry about that anymore, because now we're worrying about status ailments. The wiki does something weird here, where it puts some granted effects into this as well. Like, these granted effects shouldn't be here, they should be in the granted effects tab. Whatever. The most important part to note is, though, that status ailments are completely separate from buffs and debuffs. Once again, status ailments completely separate from buffs and debuffs. They have nothing to do with stats and debuffs, buffs and debuffs, because buffs and debuffs are all about putting stats left and right, putting numbers around, numbers going up and numbers going down. Status ailments are all about screwing over your characters. If a character is getting screwed over, that's a status ailment. You'll also know that if your character is afflicted with a status ailment, they'll also do this animation where they look like, and you see this purple smoke surrounding the character, and they look like they're in pain. That's a status ailment. It's got the purple effect to them. Now, it might look like there's quite a few status ailments that are all different, but actually, there's only really three. There's only really three status ailments. It's just that each status ailment has 3 levels of severity. So even though there's 9 in total, well, and also skill seal and Magia seal, but forget about those for now. Even though there's 9 main status ailments in total, you only really need to know that they are basically 3 categories you can put them into. And each of these categories has 3 levels of severity. So let's begin with the first effect that a status ailment can put on you, and that is incapacitation, or your character has to skip a turn, or basically charm, stun, and bind. You have at first the basic level, which is just the standard effect. This character cannot take any action. Charm. That's the weakest incapacitate there is. Then, the stun, it's a stronger incapacitate. The character cannot take any action, that's still the same, but now we're going to put something on top of that, and takes increased damage from its weak element. How much more damage from its weak element? We're going to put into damage calculation right now. There's a damage calculation page. Like I said, it's going to be a whole video on this, but just for now, like a tiny little step into this. Usually when you have type advantage, you do times 1.5 damage, so it's like 50% bonus damage. But with the status advantage, you get 1.8 instead. 1.8 instead. I don't know why there's 2 parts of this, because it's both 1.8. But yeah, so 1.8 instead of 1.5. That's the bonus damage that you do if a character is afflicted by this. And it takes the increased damage from its weak element. So for example, if a light type character is hit with a stun, and they get hit by a dark type attack, they will not just take 50% bonus damage, they will take 80% bonus damage instead. Wow, that's pretty impressive. You can do some massive damage with this. But we can go one step further. Next up, the most severe incapacitation effect there is. Bind. The character cannot take any action. We already know that. That's the same as the other ones. It also takes increased damage from its weak element. Okay, we also know that. That's the same as stun. But now we're going to put one on top of that still. And it's unable to recover HP in any way, shape, or form. No healing, no regeneration, nothing will be able to give this character HP back if they are affected with bind. By the way, the reason why some of these granted effects are on here is because these granted effects that are below here is the on-hit effect. So for example, if you see the yellow charm effect with a plus, that means if this character attacks something, that target will get inflicted with charm. Not to be confused with the charm symbol that is yellow with an X on it. That means they're immune to charm. Looks very much the same, but at least these immunity symbols aren't really used that often. Instead, people are just using status ailments, status ailment resistance. I'm going to talk about resistance later in a bit, once I'm done with these status ailments. The important bit though is that what you will often see is that connects will give these on-hit effects. For example, you will see a connect that says, I think Ailments connect, for example, says on-hit applies burn. Those are the important bits. So this was the incapacitation effect. So we now already know that charm, stun, and bind. Charm is okay. Stun is, that's pretty good. And bind is like, oh my god, that's amazing. Wow, I want to have bind. And charm, I don't care about charm. We can do better though. Let's keep going. The next effect is damage over time. And once again, 3 separate levels of severity for damage over time. The first is poison. This is why many people say poison is shit, but people love curse. Because curse is a level 3 effect, but poison is a level 1 effect. This character takes damage each turn. It's 5% of the target's maximum health per stack. It says per stack because a character can get poisoned, and then poisoned again, and then poisoned again. It will actually stack. However, a character can only receive a maximum of 10,000 damage per turn from any total of damage over time effects. So for example, if a character gets afflicted with 3 poison effects and that they would take more than 10,000 damage, for example, use this on a boss, they would instead only take a maximum of 10,000 damage. If you, for example, curse someone and then burn someone, and they would take more than 10,000 damage, they would still only take maximum of 10,000 damage in total. So no matter how much damage over time you put someone with, no matter how many different damage over time effects you try to stack, you can only do 10,000 damage per turn in total. This is also why when you curse a witch or an Uwasa in battle, you will pretty much always see it pop up as 10,000. So next up though, we have burn. Oh my god, now we're gonna do instead 10% of the target's maximum health per stack. Wow. And it also takes increased damage from its weak element. You're kind of seeing something here, that the level 2 is just, it also takes increased damage from weak element. Wow. And number 3, I mean, what are we gonna guess is gonna happen? It's 15% of the target's maximum health per stack. It takes increased damage from the weak element and is also unable to recover HP through any means. Wow. So curse is actually extremely potent. 15% damage, 15% max health damage. It can't recover HP, and it also takes increased damage from weak element. That's amazing. Compare that to poison, 5% of max health, and that's it. That's all poison does. So you can see that poison is kind of not great, and curse is actually pretty good. That's how you see why that's such a big difference between the two, even though they both kind of seem like the same. You get afflicted with them, you think, oh, they both just damage over time, right? They just do the 2 different types of damage over time. No. Curse is dead. It's deathly. Curse is dead. Curse makes you dead. I can't English. And poison is just whatever, dude. Next up though, there's the 3rd type of status ailment. It's the miss chance. For example, fog gives you a 25% chance to miss. Okay. Now we already know what the other 2 are going to be. It's a bit stronger, 35% chance to miss. Takes increased damage from its weak element. That's blind. And then we have bewitch. Once again, stronger, 50% chance to miss attack. Also takes increased damage from weak element and is unable to recover HP. We have successfully figured out how status ailments work. 3 different types, all with 3 different levels of severity. Now when I say 3 levels of severity, that doesn't mean that a character that is fogged and then gets hit by another fog ability will then be blinded. That's not how it works. No, that's not how it works. You can't upgrade status ailments. That's not how it works. That's still different effects, so you can't upgrade them. Now, if you get hit by a blind and a bewitch, I don't think that's ever happened, but I think if it does, there would actually be 2 separate chances to miss. So you would have to pass a 35% chance, and then you would have to pass a 50% chance, as far as I know. But like I said, it's pretty much never happened that I've seen that happen, so don't worry about it. I mean, there's also Skill Seal and Magia Seal, but Skill Seal and Magia Seal only ever happens in like challenge stages. But yeah, they are considered status ailments. But apart from that, Skill Seal just makes it so you can't use Memorial or like any active skill. You can't use any active skills. And Magia Seals, you can't use Magia or Doppel. It pretty much tells you right there what it does. not really anything important, and the other ones are not really used anywhere other than maybe some challenge events where some enemy might use one of these effects once in the entire game. So don't worry too much about this. It's not right on. Yeah, there it is. Don't worry about these. So yeah, that's basically it with the status ailments. So now you know about status ailments and how some of them are really, really powerful. Most notably, Bind, Curse, and Bewitch. These are the most powerful ones. I think this one actually, it's called Dazzle on JP, on NA. Dazzle. But on NA it's called Bewitch. Yeah, so much for that. Now that you know about these status effects, you might be thinking to yourself, man, I want to not get hit by status ailments. They are really powerful, some of them are really powerful, and if I'm affected by one, I can't evade anymore if I have a character that has evasion. That's terrible. I'm going to take a lot of damage, I can't heal if I'm afflicted with the powerful ones. That sucks. I need status ailment resistance. Now we're going to go back up here to status ailment resistance. This is the resistance to status ailments. How does status ailment resistance work with status ailments? Now, if you are trying to hit an enemy, for example, with a curse, and the curse has a 50% chance to land, it could be like an active Memoria that says like 50% chance to curse, for example. And your enemy then gets a status ailment resistance up above. How does that work? So let's say we start with the 50% on base, and the enemy has 15% status ailment resistance. What that means is it will take that 50% curse chance and reduce it by 15% points, meaning it goes from 50 to 35. So if the character that you're trying to apply that curse to had a 50% resistance, the 50% curse chance would drop all the way to 0% curse chance. So in order to be immune to this curse application, they don't need to have 100% status ailment resistance, they just need 50. If you have other effects, for example, let's say applies fog to all enemies for 30% chance. Sounds pretty good, right? 30% chance for fog on all enemies. Let me look something up really quick. There's this character called Ultimate Mangaka who has the EX skill, where is it? Gives all allies 30% status ailment resistance. Huh. 30% status ailment resistance. What did I say about the fog chance? Was like 35% fog chance or 30% fog chance? Yeah, it's like pretty much 0% chance to afflict that fog on someone. The reason why I brought up this specific scenario in general is because this actually happens on JP, where Ren's active that she gets from Spirit Enhancement, if you're an NA player, don't worry about this, but if you are on JP, you have the Spirit Enhancement for Ren, she has an active that applies fog to all enemies. I think it's like 35% chance. If there's an Ultimate Madoka on that enemy team, and they get 30% status ailment resistance, your chance of applying fog is 5%. Good luck trying to apply that. However, it doesn't end quite there, because of course we can counteract that with status ailment resistance decrease. And as we know from buffs and debuffs, we have the slider that goes up and down. So if those enemies have a 20%, for example, let's just say, no, let's go with the Ultimate Madoka. Let's say they have 30% status ailment resistance, and we can then apply a status ailment resistance down of only 30%, and it drops to 0. But we can go further. Let's keep applying status ailment resistance. Let's apply another 30%. Now they are at minus 30%. So at this point, if we tried to apply that fog again, that originally had 35% chance, now if the enemy is at minus 30% status ailment resistance, we now have a 65% chance of applying fog. Suddenly we're in business. So you see, when it comes to applying status ailments, status ailment resistance can actually play a pretty big role. And I think this is on purpose, so that status ailment resistance isn't useless. So for example, if you are in a challenge mode event against someone, it might be extremely difficult to apply your effects. For example, let's say you have, I'm going to pull her up, a Tomoe Mami on your team, and you use that connect right here, chance to bind and chance to burn 100%. This is really, really strong. 100% means that if an enemy has a resistance of 50%, which is pretty good, you would still have a 50% chance of applying that attack, or applying that bind, applying that burn. They would need to get to 100% in order to be immune. Oh. But on a lot of challenge events, the enemy will have status resistance, and they will have a really, really high status resistance. They might be somewhere between 80 to 100% status resistance. But you now know that it doesn't mean that you cannot apply this bind or this burn. You could just apply to the enemy a status ailment resistance down. Now don't take my word for this too much, because I don't actually know the exact numbers for how much status ailment resistance enemies have in challenge quests, because it might be possible that they have more than 100%. I don't actually think it's possible. I know that for example, for damage up, for attack, for defense, 100% is the maximum. I'm not quite sure if it's 100% the maximum for status ailment resistance as well. I assume it is. Meaning that if the enemy in a challenge quest had 100% status ailment resistance, you could use a Memoria that reduced the enemy's status ailment resistance and then once again apply that bind or burn, but you would need an active Memoria to do that. And of course, active Memoria are they have a cooldown. You can only put so many of these on your team, so there's some balance right there. But that's basically everything there is to know about buffs, debuffs, status ailments, everything under the sun. Once again, this is the skills and status effects page here in the fandom Magia wiki, if you want to read this up for yourself. There's also some other effects that are completely pointless. You don't need to know about this. It shows you the Magia types as well, what it does, some unused effects, some basically just some stuff that was never put into use anywhere, so don't worry about these. We don't even know what they are, they just say unused. But yeah, I hope you took something away from this. I hope I was able to help you with all this information. If there's anything about this that either I got wrong, tell me in the comments, or if there's something that you still want to know about all of this, also tell me in the comments. Hope you enjoyed this. Next video that is going to be an advanced guide will be next week probably, and it will be the damage calculation video. Until then, if you want to see more Magia Record content, leave that subscribe button, hit it. Don't leave it, hit it. And I'll see you guys next time.